Today we are interviewing Miss Roxie Remley, a native of Darlington, Indiana. Miss Remley, do you remember where you were December 7th, 1941?
I remember distinctly. I was at my brother's house in Racine, Wisconsin. I was a student at a business college at that time. Perhaps I had finished and had a job in Racine. And we had just come home from church and had dinner, and Jim called us, his wife and I, from the kitchen and said, "Something terrible's happening, come in here and listen." And of course it was on radio, and it was a stunning bit of news to us, and we were shocked.
Then I noticed in 1942 you enlisted in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. What month was that?
Well, that was an induction in Milwaukee, August 13, 1942, and the organization, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, had been organized in May of that year, and from the 13th of August, and on the 17th I reported to Fort Des Moines. And for basic training.
What did basic training consist of?
3 weeks of absolute surprises. I have no idea. We were given some uniforms that were surprising. We even shoes and underwear, and we had no coats at that time. They hadn't been finished making enough to get to everyone. But before we finished the 3 weeks, we had our jackets and skirts, of course, and shirts that didn't fit. But 3 weeks, and then we were asked to take tests for placement in special training schools. There were 3. One was for administrative people, and one for food, mess hall, cooking, and a third motor transport. Well, my friend Betty from Racine, with whom I had gone out there together, we joined the service. We knew that we would, of course, be in administrative school because that's what we did, each of us, in jobs back in Racine. And so she was selected to go from the testing to administrative school. I was selected to go to motor transport. That was the beginning of a new surprise for me.
Where did you take your motor transport training?
Downtown in Des Moines. We lived in the Chamberlain Hotel, and the garages and all the Jeeps and trucks and Army vehicles were located there. I presume everyone knew how to drive, but we were given tests for driving, of course. Well, I'd been driving something since I was about 12 years old, so I had no fears. We learned to change tires and change the oil, and I don't think we could have removed a motor, but anyway, we really did a lot of maintenance work on the vehicles and drove trucks all over the area. I don't know what they were moving around, but we always had something to be moved, and we were given the opportunity to drive some of those large trucks as well as Jeeps.
You mean the 6x6s?
Yes, as well as Jeeps.
As Jeeps.
Mm-hmm. But finally, I was assigned a job permanently after the 10 weeks training, and I was chosen to be the driver for the chaplain on the post. And I think it was a godsend to my folks. I believe they thought I had done the right thing finally to be able to have this assignment. It didn't last too long. It was October, November, and by November I saw the possibility of applying for OCS, and I did.
And where did you take your OCS training?
Right there at Fort Des Moines. And I was in OCS for 3 months and graduated in January, the latter part of January in 1943.
As a second lieutenant?
Well, we were called third officers then.
Third officers.
We were still an auxiliary, not really a part of the Army, but we received the same pay as men in the Army in the very beginning.
After your being commissioned, where did you go?
Immediately, I had orders. Not all of them had orders to a specific assignment, but there were 3 of us who had the same orders, and they were top secret. That was quite surprising. And we went directly to Washington, and we were to report to Bowling Field. Well, we were not in the Air Corps, and so that was a surprise, but we arrived there, and by train, of course, and reported in, and I learned why the top secret assignment. It was an experiment for a small group of women to see if they were capable of learning to operate radar equipment in anti-aircraft batteries. And it put us into a combat zone at that time on the East Coast because of the Nazi U-boats and planes, and so it was considered to be a combat area at this time, 1st of February 1943. And so I was given the assignment to go to a battery, and it was a composite battery, of which there were about 56 enlisted women and 3 officers of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and 90 men, I believe, maybe 70. I don't know the exact number in a battery, but it was a smaller number because of the women being there. So the women and officers, the enlisted women and officers, were trained on the radar equipment, the 268, the director, and the height finder. And that equipment was up on a hill out at Camp Sims, out beyond Anacostia, and the guns were located down in a kind of a valley area, and the men, of course, were on the guns. And so we were all trained over a period of a few weeks, and finally the time came when the women were to be in charge of the equipment, the radar equipment, entirely. Well, there was always practice. We were never bombed. We never were in, but it was a combat area. Therefore, it had to be top secret because at that time women were not to be in combat areas or have those assignments. So time went on. I was placed as it was a rotating system, but all at the same time. I was a mess officer and a motor transport officer and an executive officer, but there was a male officer attached to the same 3 areas, and so it was a training period really for WWII officers. And in March of that year, the decision was made to take us to Bethany Beach, I think. I don't know whether it's in Maryland or Delaware. So we were trucked over there, all the equipment, the guns were moved, all the radar equipment, and set up along the beach. And a plane was to fly by with a sleeve, and we were to have the guns aimed on the sleeve and shoot it down. The WWII commanding officer gave the command to fire. The sleeve came down. The plane was safe. we had accomplished General Marshall's experiment, and it was successful. But
when did you go overseas, ma'am, and what were the circumstances?
By this time, in March, April, plans were being made to close down the batteries. The plan was toward D-Day. And so this began in 43. And by October of 43, we had disbanded the gun battery. It was called Battery X. It didn't exist on paper. It was an assembly of all the equipment from other batteries. So we were never acknowledged, you know, in terms of a battery of A, B, C, or whatever. It was X. Well, anyway, the disbandment of it took place in September, October, and we were sent back to Bowling Field, the women were, and then we could either apply for, not apply, but ask for overseas duty or not, and I chose to ask for overseas duty. So we really remained there, parading a lot for generals and all the brass that came around in Washington and out to Bowling Field, and so we were kind of a showpiece for menial duties around at the airport there, or the airfield. And in March, finally, in March of 44, I was on board the Queen Mary to England with 800 other women and 10,000 men. And we arrived in Scotland. I'm not sure where we landed. After 13 days doing the crossing of the Atlantic. And from there to a staging area, and then the assignment for me was to the headquarters of the Service of Supply at Cheltenham. And there we had a few hundred women billeted at Oakley Farms out in the country from Cheltenham. The headquarters for the entire movement for D-Day was, of course, the headquarters of Service of Supply. That was for everything, and that was located in Cheltenham. And the women worked in those offices. And then I was a company officer there, and I was an executive officer, and I was also, by this time, a first lieutenant. We were in, I believe, someplace along the way, we had been taken into the Army, and we were no longer an auxiliary, and were known as WAC, WACS, Women's Army Corps. So my duties were everything. We did have a mess officer, we did have a motor transport officer, but somehow there was transferring or changing around, and it seemed to me I was involved in doing a lot of different things. And we had a cadre on hand in the offices at the WAC headquarters. And everything, of course, was being planned for D-Day. And so finally the day came. And on the night of, as you recall, it had been postponed.
Because of weather.
Days because of weather. And it was so foul, it really was horrible. The fog was unbelievable. But anyhow, that night of June 5th, I'll never forget it. No one was in bed. Everyone was standing outside in fields around us and watching a sky that was absolutely solid with planes. I've often wondered if they ever hit one another by accident. It was so so jammed it seemed. And it was drove after drove after drove, and we just sat down in the fields. It wasn't too comfortable. It was damp. I remember being not exactly raining, but misty rain all night long. And it was miserable, frankly. But we wouldn't go in. No one wanted to sleep. No one could. It was a terribly exciting moment in our lives. And the next daylight, here they were coming back. And of course, bringing injured, those who'd been killed. And so, even today, it's hard to talk about it.
I can appreciate that.
It really is. And I had no part in the real danger at all.
Mm-hmm.
We were perfectly safe.
How long were you in England then after
And
D-Day?
so, after D-Day, the headquarters then began to move toward London, to London, just as the troops moved into France and so on. And so after the headquarters moved, so did all the women go with them for their offices and the handling of administrative duties. And it was a tremendously big force that was involved there, because supplies, of course, were needed and kept right on coming and coming and coming. And in October, we were finally able to close the detachment in Cheltenham, and I was the last to leave, and I had a driver that day, and she and I were the only ones left, the women, and we went to London in October, last of October. And we arrived in London in a frightful time. The V2s had just begun. The Nazis had been sending the buzz bombs,
yes,
to London for a good long time, and you could hear them coming in. And so there was a chance of shelter and safety, but the V2s were quite different. They couldn't be heard, and nothing happened until they exploded on the ground, and if you were there, that's bad. Well, they lasted all through the winter. It was a devastating time in London. The V2s were coming hourly, day and night. They never ceased. And I was never injured. None of our women were. We were located on Upper Grosvenor Street, not far from the embassy, in a very fine section of London, Mayfair district. And the women lived in billets that were 5 stories high, and some of them had only 4 left. It was a horrible time to see London. And finally the day came, VE Day. But it was a time of shifting troops. We still had not had victory with Japan, and we'd been through the Battle of the Bulge that December, which was quite a shocking experience, I think, for the Allies, but we made it. And finally, VE Day came. I'm trying to think of the date. It was April 7th, I think. And
yes, I believe you're right.
And so, when the war ended in Europe, many were transferred to the Pacific Theater, and some were ready to be shipped back to the States. And of course, men who had been in battle were certainly the ones to go first. So the women in London, some 300 in our detachment. We were the only detachment in London. And we were taken care of, I guess, by being involved in a lot of recreational activities, one thing and another. And I was coaching softball team, and we won the tournament in the UK base, and that meant we could go to the finals in Nice, France. So in July, here I was going off to Nice, and I have no idea whether we won or lost anything there. I was so, I guess, taken up with the Riviera and all the beauty of it. But back to London, in May of that year, 1945, it would be the 3rd anniversary of the Women's Army Corps. And so it was expected that every unit would have some kind of celebration. Well, in London, it was expected that it would be something rather special. It was a major location. And word got around, don't know how, but we had a telephone call from headquarters saying that the Queen had shown a desire to visit our detachment. And so immediately the invitation was extended to the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth she was.
Wasn't it Queen Mary?
No, it was Elizabeth.
That's right.
And it was George IV's wife, or sixth, George VI. They had 2 little girls, 2 young girls. They were in teens and maybe 20 by the time war ended. And that was Elizabeth, and don't recall the other girl's name, but they were both in service. The one who was the princess that has died, I believe, was it with some farming unit. I simply don't recall the name of it. But Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, was in the ATS, and that was comparable to the WWII, Women's Army Corps. Well, anyhow, the invitation extended.
Excuse me, I'm going to change the tape here. We'll just take a break later.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the Queen was invited, and she accepted the invitation, and the date was set, and I believe she arrived at our detachment headquarters offices at 37 Upper Grosvenor Street about 10 o'clock on that morning of May the 12th. And the driver got out of the limousine and came around, opened the back door. We were, the 3 of us, there were 3 officers at that time, and we were lined up in front of the door on the street, on the sidewalk, and she stepped out of her limousine, extending her hand, which was so nice because we were not supposed to curtsy. We had uniforms on, and it wasn't proper to be saluting her. And so how would we perform? And we were told by headquarters we were simply to stand there and let her make the first movement. And so when she extended her hand to our commanding officer, Captain Watson, it was a great thrill. And then she shook hands with each of us. And we had with us the commanding general of the headquarters, no one else with us. And so we were introduced by our commanding officer by name to her, and she was asked to step inside. And so the party that went up to the 5th floor of that billet to each of the rooms where the enlisted women were relieved from duty and standing beside their bunks. The party who went up the steps were our commanding officer, our WWII commanding officer, and our first sergeant, and the general of headquarters of Service of Supply. I went back to my office and sat down and waited until I got further notice of what I was supposed to do. The other officer waited in my office with me. And so, in a little while, they came back downstairs. We had 5 billets like that, and they were brought into my office, and she sat at my desk and signed a Pallas Athene. That was the Women's Army Corps insignia, and it was the head of Pallas Athene, the Greek goddess who represents the goddess of victory. And it was cut out of a poster board and had been designed with the date and the place and a place for her signature. And she signed her name, but we also had another manila folder with a sheet of paper in it with a line on it for her to sign, just in case, you know, we would have 2 signatures. And she signed it too. And her lady-in-waiting was standing behind her, and the commanding officer, and so there was a photograph of this event. I was standing on in a location that was not part of the picture, so I was never photographed with her. But I certainly watched the occasion. They got up, she got up from the chair there, and they went out the door and went to the next billet and to the next one, and she climbed the steps all the way. There was no elevator. They wouldn't be using elevators. They probably didn't work anyway. Certainly we never used them. And finally to the last billet. She didn't go in, I think, the last 2 billets, but in the very last one was around the corner from Upper Grosvenor Street to Park Street. And at Park Street, that billet on the ground floor had the PX. And so that's where her limousine was located. So we walked following her around the corner, and there stood our PX sergeant with a box, and she dashed up to the Queen and presented it to her. Well, to our horror, we didn't know a thing about this and didn't know that that the enlisted women had planned such a thing. The Secret Service grabbed that box before the Queen could touch it, and that was the end of that, and we were just shocked because we didn't know, and the Secret Service didn't know this was going to happen. Well, poor Sergeant Stewart said, well, we thought we should give her a gift, and it contained candy bars from the PX to be given to her daughters.
You know, that's the film or that.
We didn't know that the enlisted women had gotten together and put a box of candy bars from the PX to be given to the Queen's daughters.
How long did you stay in England after this occurred?
So this was May, and then, as I mentioned a moment ago, the recreational period, and we were transferring women to France, to Paris office, and going with them, and I was, and flying back for a couple of months in there in summer. And by September it was time to close the detachment down, and I again was the last one to leave and did all the finishing up of details, and left for Stone, England for a staging area. My number was coming up to return to the States. So by October I was in Stone, and on November the 5th, I and 1,000 others, women, boarded the Queen Mary, and we returned to New York Harbor in 5 days. We had had 13 going over in the Ile-de-France on that boat. Well, so I simply was sent to Fort Des Moines for separation from service, and November 15th, roughly, I returned back home again in Indiana, Crawfordsville.
And did you stay in the reserves?
No, I didn't. I had leave time, and so I was not separated really from service until January, middle of January. And in February, I had made the decision to enter college, and I don't recall the exact date, but anyway, I was in college that winter and spring, summer, and from 1947. And in 1949, I had a master's degree in August of '49 from Peabody College, and took the job of teaching art in the junior high school and East Junior High in Nashville, Tennessee. And the following summer, they were looking for, came to Peabody looking for someone to teach summer school at Georgia Teachers College at Statesboro, Georgia. And so I proceeded to apply and was hired, and after I was down there and was teaching in this art workshop that summer, they were looking for someone to add to the art department, to the one instructor that was teaching there. And I applied, and they hired me. And that was 1950, and I remained there and retired in 1976, and have been retired longer than I taught.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and giving us.
I'd like to go back and kind of do some local history with.
Okay, fine.
And where you're born, raised, who your parents are, kind of some roots.
Yes.
Can we kind of go back to that? And then I'd like to get into a little bit more of your art career and
all right. And there's also an interesting story, but it's on that paper. Am I off?
No,
we're on.
Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, it had to do with in 1982 going back and making an effort to meet the Queen Mother in London. And so we went to the embassy. The woman who'd been in, the commanding officer, Georgia Watson, was the one who had greeted her that day. And so we went to the embassy and asked the procedure. And so there's that story. And then there's another story that still involves the Queen Mother, in which I was involved in 2000.
Well, let's hear them.
That's interesting.
It is. And I think you might enjoy having that as part of this tape. In '82, so Georgia and I went, she was teaching in, she was head of psychology department, Georgia Teachers College. Well, I was Georgia Southern by this time. And so we spent, we went in November because we could go on the QE2 and come back on it and land at Cape Canaveral, which would be close by for transporting us. And so we were there for a month because of the schedule of the QE2. We arrived in London in 1st of November. We went to the embassy. We did a lot of things, but one day we went to the embassy. How would we proceed to visit the Queen Mother, and explained why we wanted to do that. And we were told how, so we went back to the hotel and wrote the letter to the lady in waiting. And in about 4 or 5 days, we had an answer. And of course, being at the hotel, that would be the possibility of receiving the answer by letter. And indeed, the Queen Mother did remember the occasion of May in 1945, visiting the Women's Army Corps headquarters and women, and she would be delighted to have us come to greet her or speak to her, visit her. So, we, with the letter in hand, we hailed a taxi on the day that we were to appear at 12:15. She was very busy, the letter said, and she would have a few moments to give to us. But she did have a luncheon at 12:30 or near maybe 1 o'clock. The taxi driver said, "I can't drive to Clarence House." And we said, "Well, take us to the nearest gate and we'll walk the rest of the way." So he knew where he could drive, and he let us out, and we paid him and started down a long walk to Clarence House, and reached the door, and there was a guard on either side of the door standing there, very erect, and without, I believe, even punching a doorbell, the door suddenly opened, and the gentleman in tails said, "May I help you?" And we handed him the letter that I have the story mixed up all of a sudden. That was oh golly, I've got to think back about this real quickly. Let me put it this way. This was the event of going to see her. The letters had been, that was the very first letter. We delivered it by hand to Clarence House, and that happened first. And it was an answer to that letter when the butler said yes, he would take the letter to Her Majesty immediately, and thanked us for coming. And that was unexpected. They didn't know that we were going to hand deliver a letter to them, of course. This was asking for, or accepting the occasion that we would like to see her, or asking for the occasion. That was it. And then in response, we got the letter from the hotel. Then we came to the day that we were to arrive. And so the butler was expecting us. And so he said, "Come right in, madam." And we stepped inside, and the lady in waiting was called by, I don't know what means, there were no words spoken, but she came down the stairway and met us, and yes, they were looking for us that very day, of course, at that time, and took us upstairs because we had to wait. The Queen Mother was visiting with some Australian friends at that moment. And so we talked to this lady, Angela, I believe was her name. And it was not more than 5 minutes that we were told to descend the stairs, and we would now go to the reception room where the Queen Mother was. And so we were taken into that room, and the double doors were opened by the butler, and there stood the Queen Mother so beautifully, with her hand extended again, just as in 1945. And we shook hands, and she immediately said she remembered so clearly that visit with the women of the United States Army. And we had a folder, we had a picture of her to present to her in case she didn't remember signing that Palace Athene emblem that we had asked her to sign. And it was a good-sized picture, and she took it in her hands and looked at it, and she said, "You know, I'll never forget that hat. It was the only one I had." Well, we laughed. We thought that was great. And she did too. She was such a delightful person to be around. So you felt comfortable. And we talked about Diane and Charles' wedding had taken place I think maybe that year or the year before, 1981 or 2. And she was surprised that we were so knowledgeable about the wedding and that it had created so much news worldwide. And we were there probably no more than 10 minutes. And we departed. And the butler thanked us for coming, and so did the lady in waiting. And we walked out of there feeling like we had really accomplished the greatest thing that could happen in our lives. And walked down Stable Yard Road. I don't know where it led to, but we walked out of there and finally got to a street where there were taxis again, and on our way back to town. This location of Clarence House is very close to Buckingham Palace. In the meantime, from 1982 to the year 2000, I was in southern France, and I had an occasion to be talking with some British people up in the Alps at the Rothschild estate, which is a museum now. And an old gentleman, I'm sure he was much younger than I, but he looked ancient, said to me after I had told them of my wonderful opportunities to meet their queen, he said, "You know, you must send her greetings. This is her 100th, you know." And I said, "Well, yes, that would be nice," thinking, my goodness, I hadn't thought of such a thing. But all the way home, I had it on my mind, well, yes, maybe I could send her birthday greetings. Well, what would it be? Well, my profession is painting, and I thought maybe I could do something, and then what would you do on a birthday card? And I went looking and finally decided that the best thing would be to do a transfer of a painting by computer to the front of a birthday card or birthday greeting, and I'd have to find someone then to write a verse for the inside. And I had a friend who is really a fine poet in Statesboro. And so the cover turned out very nicely with this photograph transferred from one of my paintings, and it was a very bright blue sky with loaded with bright yellow daisies, and wind-blown in a way it looked, and so it was called Windblow. I asked Libba Smith to write a poem for me. She said, "Well, I've never written a poem for a queen or royalty, but I'll give it a try." I had called her to come to my house and told her about it. And so she went home, and well, in an hour she called me and said, "I have something, but I don't know whether you want it or not." And I said, "Well, I would be glad to hear it." So she came over to the house and read it to me. I couldn't think of anything that could be more special. Oh.
Whoops. Remember, we're here. I'll get it for you.
It's that folder right there. I want to read it. It's so special. It's very short. On this 4th day of August 2000, a salute to Her Majesty, a true national treasure, whose life has been an example of grace and charm without measure, who has seen her country England through its many joys and tears, with her special radiance for now 100 years. All the world rejoices and is deeply grateful too that we can share a portion of this century with you. Signed, sincerely, Roxie Remley. And so I mailed it, but I had to identify myself. Why? She wouldn't have remembered my name. I took the photograph. I had a copy made of that original photograph from 1945 where she was signing the Palace Athene. And I also wrote a letter that I was in that midst of that day, but I was not in any photograph with her. And so I sent it off with the birthday greeting, and I think within 7 days I had an answer from her secretary saying, "I have laid your greetings before Her Majesty," and so forth. Beautifully written letter thanking me for sending the birthday greetings to the Queen Mother. Well, the old man back there in southern France had said to me, "Mail it in June." And I said, "Oh, that's when her birthday is." And he said, "Oh, no, her birthday's in August." But he said, "You must mail it in June so that you'll get an answer." And so I mailed it in June. And the last of the episodes with the Queen Mother. On May 12, 2001, I attended the dedication of the newly built U.S. Army Women's Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia. I had sent the entire collection of letters, the Queen's signature, photographs, everything that I had accumulated from all these, this period of time, to that museum. On dedication day, I walked into the museum, and there on the counter lay a scrapbook opened. To the Queen's picture. I was not visible in that picture, of course, standing nearby, but I surely remembered the occasion. You had some questions to ask me.
Well, I just wanted to review. You were you born in Darlington?
I was born out. My father, James C. Remley, left the home place on Sugar Creek out near the country club in Crawfordsville, where his father had come in 1800. And James was the oldest of, I think, 6 sons. And he didn't stay down here, but went to another section of the county. And I believe, I would assume, with a land grant, established himself with 160 acres and farmed it, cleared it, and farmed it. And in 1880 or 1882, he built a house. He had married Marianne Bird Craig from around Ladoga in the 1870s. He was 50 years old, incidentally, when he married. And she had 3 children from a former marriage, and they were Frank and Ed and Nora Craig. And I don't know anything about the families of Ed and Frank, but Nora married H.L. Trask, who was a jeweler here in Crawfordsville for many, many years. And then my dad was born in the house that his father had built. He might have been born in the log cabin, and the dates there are not clear in my mind. Anyhow, his sister was born first, Minnie. In 1878, Dad was born in 1880. And by 1907, Dad married Helen Lynch, who lived in Darlington. The farm was located about 2 miles from Darlington, out through the covered bridge, and another mile beyond it, and that would be about 2 miles. And by that time, they had accumulated more land, and I believe the final acreage was 240 acres. And also in the meantime, grandfather had bought land around Logansport, and that was farmed by Frank or Ed Craig. I never did see that land or where they lived there and raised a family, either one or both of them. I really don't know which. In 1907, or 1907, 8, 9, about 1910, grandfather and grandmother Remley moved in town, built a house in town, in Darlington, and moved in town. In 1907, in the winter of 1907, James was born, my brother James, and they had been married from January. He was born in October. So my mother was 17 years old at that time, and so this would be quite a challenge, I'd think, for her to have a newborn baby and having been married the same year. Then 2 years later, John was born. And so we have Jameses and Johns all through from the 1600s right on. Remley Hurd did a marvelous study of family, and then Walter Remley followed in the genealogy. And so there's a good record back to Pennsylvania when some of these Remleys came over from the area of Germany, Austria, and some of them remained in that part of the country, and some moved west. And my great-grandfather moved west and ended up in Crawfordsville, and had a tanning business in Ohio before he came here. There were 6 sons in that original family of my grandfather, and so they all remained in Montgomery County. Most of them stayed around Waynetown, had farms. There was John W. Remley, who was a representative, state representative, I believe, in early 1900s. We used to have Remley reunions, so I remember these people quite well, and there were usually 60, 70 people who attended. They were all Remleys. They all had Remley names because those 6 sons, there were very few women in the family, and so the name held for a lot of generations. And surprisingly, it still does to me. Yesterday at this gallery where my paintings are hanging in the library here, Millie Remley O'Sullivan came, and of course she looked as beautiful as she always did, and she's older than I. And she said, I said to Millie, "You just look beautiful today." And she said, we have to, we're Remleys." And I thought, Well, that was a pretty bold thing to be saying, but it was probably just about right.
Now, how were you related to Remley her?
His mother, I always called her Aunt Sally. She was not not an aunt to me, but she was a first cousin to my dad. So Remley and I would be third cousins.
So he was one of the founders of the Montgomery County Historical Society.
His father was.
His father was.
Yeah, Cheryl Herr.
Okay, that's right.
And it was, Cheryl was one of those fortunate people who was a very bright man apparently, and had made an invention and had a very nice income, I'm sure, from that source. And Sally had inherited her father's farm, I believe. I don't know much about their business and their inheritance, but they were in a position to do some very wonderful things around here in the city, and they were especially interested in Lane Place and making it open to the public after the family had passed on. And Aunt Sally's father, of course, was Ambrose Remley, who had been in the Civil War, and he was a very favorite uncle of my dad's. And I've always heard of Uncle Ambrose, and he, of course, was a brother to my grandfather. And in Ambrose Remley's writings, in his diary that's been published by the family, he's made the statement that after the Civil War, and he came back home, he was considered to be nominated by the new Republican Party for governor of the state, but he felt he couldn't accept even the beginnings of such a thing because he didn't have the education. And I suppose in talking with Eleanor Herr yesterday, referring to that story, she said, I suppose they really had nothing more than an 8th grade education, and he felt that wasn't adequate.
Now, was your father, was he a farmer?
Yes, my dad was a farmer, and we had some bad seasons in crops in the late 20s, and he found it necessary to borrow money to plant the next crop, and borrowing again for the next crop, and then 1929. And so there was the crops were not good. We were getting 3 cents a bushel for wheat and or grain at any rate, and it was a bad time. In 1933, the loan company had taken the farm over. There was no way to pay back what was borrowed, and we moved from the farm in 1933 to a farm across our woods. I don't know, it was called the Martz Farm. It was owned by a Mr. Martz in Darlington, and we rented. I was a freshman in high school, and we rented that farm for those 4 years. And when I graduated in '37, that's when I went to Racine and to business college, and to live with my brother Jim and his wife Ruth Carson Remley, who was from Darlington also. And the folks, Cheryl Herr, had them moved to his farm south of Crawfordsville, and I think they were there for a year. It was a temporary move because they would provide for an apartment at Lane Place, and my mother would be the curator, historic home of Lane Place.
And at that time, the Lane Place was owned by the city?
Yes. The family had passed on. There had been one niece, or I don't know who, but one relative of the Lane family left, and she was living in the house, and she had died. And the city bought the house, as I recall. I don't know too much about all of that detail. I wasn't here. And so I know that the folks moved in there, that there was the apartment was made available for them to live at the back of the house, a living room, kitchen, and upstairs was their bedroom and bath. And I don't know if this is a wise thing to record for history, but when my mother made decisions for all of us, and when Christmas time came that first year and every year after, when we came home, whether it was summer or winter, the house was closed down. And the board knew this, and it was all right, they agreed. And we were provided places to sleep in that house. And so I'm sure I slept in Henry Lane's bed. I know I did.
So how long was your mother curator there?
Till 1971, I would guess, until she was taken. My brother John was the one who really was in charge of things here. He lived in Indianapolis, and I was teaching in Georgia, and he was the one who really made the decisions and cared and visited, took care of her really. And finally, it was necessary for her to be in a nursing home, and that was 1971. I would guess that date. So I don't know I don't know whether Mike came then or not. I don't know Mike's last name now.
Mike Hall, you're talking. No, Mike came when?
Well, I'm not sure. Tell us about Darlington when you were around there before you...
in the 30s. That would be my heyday. And of course, I belonged to the Methodist Church and was a part of the a cappella choir and a part of every activity that ever happened, I guess, in the high school. I wanted to be and was in the operettas and the plays and played softball in the 6th grade. That's where I learned to play in Mr. Miller's class. Also, we were fortunate at Darlington School to have an art teacher and music teacher. She did both, from 1st grade to 12. And I've always been very grateful for that because I loved art and was doing painting, and I recall specifically in the 3rd grade and from there on. And by the 6th grade, I won a contest in poster design for something. And that was all a real stimulus to me. And I was taking...
Do you remember her name?
Reggie Surface. Yes, indeed. She's passed on, of course. But she was a marvelous music and art teacher. She directed the choir at the Methodist Church, and we saw her every day of our lives, I guess, or at least I did. And in high school, there were 4 people who took art as high school. As high school students, and they were Harold Carson, who was in my class, my graduating class, Lee Cox, who now teaches at Ohio State. I think she's in English, maybe. And she may be retired, probably so. And Charlie Shannon, who was from Shannondale, and I. Were the only people I believe ever took art in high school when I was there. And we were there in those classes those 4 years. And it wasn't popular. It wasn't. It never has been. It's the minority of people, I guess, are interested in the arts, or at least in visual arts. But that was where the idea and interest in my background came from. And I knew when I got out of service that that was really what I wanted to do somehow. I couldn't have made a living painting, and so most people can't unless you're in New York and on a very top level of exhibiting and so forth.
Was the high school and the grammar school combined?
Yes, we were all in one school.
And how many were in your graduating class in high school?
The school building was built in 1913, and that was the first building. There had been an academy there before that. In fact, Margaret Brainerd Walter's mother, my aunt, was one of the first graduates of high school in Darlington, and that was 1900. So, what'd you ask me?
Well, how many do you remember?
Oh, yes. In my graduating class, 17. And of those 17, I don't think there are more than 5 maybe living.
So what was the commercial, the business district of Darlington like in those days?
Main Street was filled with stores. In my day, of course, the movie theater was very busy, and that man who owned it also owned the paper, Charles Marshall. And his children keep the house that they lived in and come back to Darlington and live there on whenever they return to Indiana. I don't know where they live, but they're not in this region at all. I think California maybe. So that was very important, that paper. In fact,
was it published weekly or daily?
Weekly.
Weekly.
And Dale, what's his name? Butch Dale, who has been a sheriff of Montgomery County, and he's also a librarian. And he has kept the library open through these years, and it serves the children in that community and adults too. But they have business going on there. That's all that's going on in Darlington, seems to me right now. And I get a copy, Xerox copy of the paper occasionally. He sends to old friends and families. And one I received recently, and I brought it up here because I wanted my niece to see it. On the front page, there's a little article that says Mr. and Mrs., I think, James Wells from Jamestown entertained their son, Herman W. Wells, and wife. And I looked at it, and I thought, well, my niece has a daughter who had a 4-year Herman Wells scholarship to IU in a few years back. And so I thought she ought to read that. That made note in the Darlington paper.
Now there was one bank in Darlington when back then?
Yes, there were 2. I remember 2. Of course, one was closed during the Depression. I don't know which one. But the Farmers Merchants Bank remained there for a long time. And I don't recall, I can't come up with his name now. Spence, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, there has been a bank there all the time. And I think there's a bank there now. I don't know who owns it now. It's been sold, I understand. But the business, it was a good furniture store. My uncle Bert Brainerd and Earl Butler owned the furniture store and the business of undertaking. They were the undertakers. And they started the business, and it lasted their lifetime, of course. Lifetimes. Lives.
Now, Becky Deggets was a
Her name...
schoolgirl friend?
Yes, she was 2 years younger than I.
So Becky's from Darlington also?
Yes. But our mothers were very close friends, and Becky was in everything that I was in. The Sunshine Society and the Methodist Choir, Junior Choir, and any other organization that existed. So we were friends then.
What was her maiden name? What were her parents?
Ray, W-R-A-Y. Her dad came from around Newmarket, and I think her mother may have too. And her uncle is Lyle, what?
Seaman?
Seaman.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, where is her husband?
That's her mother's brother, youngest brother.
Where's her husband from?
He's from near Chicago, and he was a student. Bill Deggets.
Bill, yeah.
Was a student at Wabash in 1942 to 46, and then in service, I believe, and then back here, and employed then by Wabash Controller, something like that.
Yes. And where did he meet Becky? Was he an undergraduate?
When he was in as a student at Wabash, and I don't know the year they married, but it would be, I think, before World War II. I mean, before he went into service. I'm not sure of those dates.
I suppose there were barber shop and
Yes.
hardware stores.
Yes, I told Becky last night I used to go into the barber shop. It was the back end of the pool room. That her dad owned both of those. And the two barbers, of course, were men. And that's where I got my hair cut. My mother didn't, of course. She went to Mrs. Cooper, who had a beauty shop. But I preferred to... I wore my hair straight with bangs, and it was just right for those barbers to cut my hair. And it was a little unusual. It isn't now to find men in beauty shops, but at that time, the men cut men's hair, and the women cut women's hair. So I was a little off there on my patronization. But the town was a very busy community, and it had grown. They had band concerts every Wednesday night, and one of the fellows who played in the band, they were from Crawfordsville, and one of the band players was Gene Patton. There was a family of Pattons here in Crawfordsville, about 4 boys. And one of Gene married Kathleen Remley. Kathleen was the daughter of Merle Remley, who was sheriff of the county for years. And they lived down at the jail. In fact, they were married, I believe. Gene and Kathleen were married at the jail. And recently, bringing that family up to date, she lives in Indianapolis. Jean died many years ago. And they had a son, Dick. And Dick was in high school with my niece, Jane. And one day he said to her, "You know, my mother's maiden name was Remley, and her name was Jane Remley." And well, she didn't know who that was. She had no idea. She went home, told her dad about it, and well, yes, well, we're all related. So they kept in touch through the years. war came along, or I don't know, maybe Korean War, but whenever, Dick had joined the Air Force someplace along the way. And in the end, he became a pilot and was the pilot for Air Force II. And so he called his mother one day, back 20 years ago maybe, and said, I'm flying Mrs. Reagan into Indianapolis to give a speech, and I want to call you after she has departed from the plane, and you and Jane come out and I'll take you through the plane. And so they went out to the airport and visited and saw Dick and Air Force II.
Now, do you know Elizabeth Castor?
Yes.
McCarthy?
Yes.
Backing now.
Now, she went to Crawfordsville High School from Shenandoah. But, so I wasn't in school with her. But there was some connection, and I can't identify with it at the present. But my folks knew Jess Castor's, Mr. Castor and his wife. I didn't. I was a child, and I don't know how that connection came about. But they were well-known farmers, and probably well-known Republican farmers. in a little printout that Laverne Remley gave me one time has a sketch of my dad. This would be about 1915. An upcoming young farmer and with a family of 2 boys, and some things that he had done, I don't know, about farming, and it was his father's farm and so forth. And it didn't identify the church he belonged to, but it said he was of the Republican Party. I don't know, that's really something.
Well, you know, the Republican Party is exceedingly strong in Montgomery County.
I know that, but my mother was not part of that, and I wasn't either, and I'm not, I should say. She was the exact opposite of my dad, but they got along all right.
Now, the Darlington Covered Bridge, was that used in regular?
Yes, I understand. I have nothing to verify it, but I've always been told that my grandfather Lynch, George Lynch, who came as a young boy, about 16, to Canada from Ireland in the 1850s, and then married Adeline Hewson there, and they moved into Indiana and finally ended up in Darlington. And that Grandfather Lynch was one of the people who he was not a contractor but a builder, and he helped build that bridge. I have nothing to verify that with. It's only hearsay. But it's likely that he did.
Well, it's still standing, so he did a good
Yes.
job.
Well, I went through it to go to school in the school bus every day. Now you can't drive through it, but you can walk through it. I went out to see I go out to see this house that I was born in, that my dad was born in, and that my grandfather built. For the past few years, last 7 or 8 years, I'd say, I go out there because the Coons live there and own the house, and they like to keep it in good shape, and it is very much like it was, except for the kitchen. The woodwork has never been painted. It's still good, solid, whatever, oak or pine or something, and varnished. And they like to hear stories I tell them about the house and my years of living there. And so I went out once, drove my niece's car. She lets me bring it over here. And I went out by myself and decided I would drive up to the covered bridge, to the entrance, and just take a look and walk through. And I did. And so when I was ready to leave, I backed out of that narrow little gravel road and saw trailers and so forth. People, I presumed, lived there, and backed into that little decline into mud. And I had a what they called an whatever, SUV, and it sank right down to the hubcaps. Oh, I was horrified. I couldn't possibly get out. So I went out to the main road and stood there, waited and waited for a car to come by. Finally I saw a UPS truck coming. I hailed him and I said, I need help. And are you going into town? Yes, he was. Well, he said, you know, I think I can find you help back here. This fellow who lives in a house down the road has a, I don't know what to call it, but that you can pull things out of.
A wrecker.
Something like a wrecker, only it's a farm implement. It has a cabin, enclosed cabin on it.
Some kind of a loader or
tractor? Tractors. Sorry, it was some kind of a tractor. And he said, I'll go back and get him. And so, in a little while, I don't know, it seems like forever, here came this fellow in the tractor with his little boy with him. And then the little boy was looking over everything. He was cute as could be. And yes, well, he'd get down there and see what he could do. So he drove his tractor down and stayed on the road, got out, and went over and got in the car and drove right out of it. He simply knew where to put it in gear, and I didn't even know about.
It must have been a four-wheel drive.
That's right, it must have been.
It was four-wheel drive. Well, I thought I ought to have known that. I had some experiences with Jeeps and one thing and another. But anyway, I didn't. Oh, I finally got out. Well, it was a big mess of mud on the car, of course. Well, I can't drive back to Indianapolis this way, or any place. So there isn't a filling station in Darlington anymore.
Yes, there is now.
Is there?
Coming up 47, after you pass the Darlington sign, you turn to the left. It's a convenience store and a Marathon gas station.
Well,
the gas is always cheaper than Crawfordsville.
Yeah. Well, I found that station. That's where I went. But it's outside of the city limits.
Yes.
So it's not in town, you see. That's why I've made that comment. Well, so I went there, and of course they don't have a car wash, but they had some hose, and a girl came out and said, yes, she would help me clean it up. And so with the hose, we got the mud off of the car, and I drove off. But anyway, it's an experience always. Now I take my great-nephew to see the house. He lives in Chicago, and he doesn't know a thing about Darlington and Crawfordsville and all this. And I had both his father and mother, my nephew and his wife, have both died in the last 5 years. So Jason is up there in Chicago kind of on his own. He's not married, and he's about 32 or 3. So he comes down here to meet me every time I come up in the summer. And I've had him in Statesboro. And he's getting oriented to a new kind of people, I think. And I'm very glad. And so Sunday, he came brought his girlfriend with him, and I was delighted.
And just to sort of bring this up to date, you're exhibiting your artwork at the Crawfordsville Public Library Gallery.
That's right, and it'll hang through the month of June, and then it'll be shipped back to me. I had the exhibit I had planned it. It was so long ago. It was supposed to come here first, but as dates got changed around for one reason or another, I ended by having the exhibit in a nearby town of Statesboro called Swainsboro, Georgia, 30 miles from Statesboro, where I live. And that occurred in the month of March. And in that exhibit I had 26 paintings hanging representing the past 2 years of painting that I'd planned for up here. And I sold 11 of them. And so I ended up a little short. And to make up for it, I borrowed paintings that were owned by people who had bought my work down there. I think I borrowed 6 or 7. And then I asked Jason in Chicago to bring his. I asked Jane in Indianapolis to bring hers. And her son has one of mine. And Luke. And so I added one. There was another one from Jane's mother-in-law, and so it ended up with about 10 paintings that were not for sale.
Well, Roxie, we certainly have enjoyed our visit with you.
Thank you for making time for us.
Well, I'm delighted. I'll go on forever, I guess. I don't know that I'm a great speaker, but anyway, I enjoy talking.
You have had a very interesting history.